I've used the longest 3 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, delighted to have you today joining us on our webinar on the pathways to net zero, challenges and opportunities associated with aging assets. Before I go any further, I just want to warn everyone that this session is being recorded. So by staying on, you are giving your agreement. You, of course, will not be seen or heard, and your questions will be sent in anonymously. We will make the replay available on the Chapter Zero France website, and you will have loads of opportunities to ask questions in the chat function. So please send them as they come to you. We'll be monitoring them during the discussion and weaving them into the discussion, as well as taking them at the end when I go through all of the audience questions. Just to warn you also that at the end of this session, there will be a very short feedback form, and we would love for you to tell us what was good, what was not so good, so that we can make sure that these sessions really meet your expectations in future and improve continuously, as they say. So a couple of words of introduction on Chapter Zero France and the wider climate governance initiative, of which Chapter Zero France is a member. This is a movement that we launched in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. Our mission is to promote the implementation of a set of best practice climate governance principles that were developed by the World Economic Forum. There are 8 of them. Today, we are going to focus on Principle 4, which is assessment of risks and opportunities. The goal of this initiative is to give directors the competencies and the skills that they need to bring climate change into the boardroom and to place it at the heart of strategic planning and board decision-making processes, so board governance. We also want to create a community of directors who exchange with each other and exchange with experts so that we have this opportunity to improve our skills as we go. How does this work in practice? We produce tools that we make available to you to take back to your boards, to share with your colleagues on the board, to share with management. We do workshops and webinars and conferences like what we're doing today. Chapter Zero France has had 11 of these in the last 6 months, so it's been a very busy half year. Those of you who tuned in yesterday will have seen the presentation of an actual tool that was on a legal primer on the duties and obligations of board directors in respect of climate change. And just a word of thanks to our supporting chairs. Chapter Zero France has been has received the endorsement of Jean Lumière, the chairman of BNP Paribas, Denis Kessler, chair of SCORE, and Lorenzo Benismaghi, chair of Société Générale. And this really just shows you the level of engagement that we are getting from some of France's leading companies. And I should add, we're having this around the world with our 13 other existing chapters and the other dozen that are in the pipeline. So we're going to be covering all 5 continents and hopefully in the not too distant future, all G20 countries. So with that, I would like to turn to our speakers and just introduce them to you. We've got Brioni Woodop, as you can see, a partner at DLA Piper, Julien Alphon, who's head of pensions and corporate solutions at BNP Paribas, and he will focus on the financial implications of what we're talking about today. Olivier Perrin, partner in energy, resource, and industrials at Deloitte. So, and then me, myself, I am just a director of an oil and gas company. Oh, and also I chair the global initiative of the Climate Governance Initiative. So let's now turn to the purpose of this session. We are going to focus on the subject of aging assets. This is not a new subject. Aging assets have existed as long as man has had industrial activities. And it has always been marked by certain challenges, principally the fact that what was good enough 10 or 20 years ago is often not good enough anymore. That's sort of the continuing saga of having to remediate past activities. The laws can sometimes be inconsistent from one country to another. Contractual clauses may differ from one deal to another. and companies may have funded to a greater or lesser extent the future obligations that they are incurring through the operation of these assets. And then we want to overlay onto this long-standing issue, this classic issue that every industrial company has always had to contend with. We want to overlay the energy transition. And why is that? Because the energy transition is going to force many of us who operate in highly climate-exposed industries to accelerating that process of winding down our assets. And so we are going to have to confront this perhaps earlier than we had planned, in an environment where investor expectations and societal expectations are only moving in one direction, and that's upward, where directors need to think carefully about how they manage both the compliance elements, but also the best practice operational elements. I always think in terms of, if this were on the front page of the newspaper, would I be satisfied with how we're being described out there? And that's a pretty tough test. And this is an issue that is relevant in a handful of sectors, but it is really dominant: oil and gas, mining, chemicals, nuclear energy, and coal-fired power plants. And I would add, in the case of my company, we're also doing some cleanup of old landfills where the land is being redeveloped for residential use. So, but that's similar techniques, but different liability structure. So we're going to discuss today what constitutes best practices in this area. And we're going to ask our experts to advise us on what it is that boards should be looking for, what questions they should be asking in the boardroom of their management teams to ensure that our companies are adhering to best operational practice, at the same time optimizing costs, because we have to keep an eye to that, particularly when activities are being curtailed sooner than we thought, and we are facing the possibility of stranded assets. And we need to be very, very mindful of negative externalities. In other words, those impacts that we cause, in this case, typically on the environment, soil, water table, et cetera. And as I said, in a world where everybody is scrutinizing us far more than was the case in the past, we're going to examine how the energy transition is a potentially a game changer in this area. And finally, we're going to look at the financial implications of this phenomenon, and looking in particular at some of the innovations that are available in the bond and bank debt markets. So with that, I'm going to turn to our speakers. First of all, invite all three of you to make any opening comments based on the scene setting that I've just done before we dive into the questions. Does anyone have anything they would like to add? Okay, I'm not seeing any waving or any microphones turning green, so we'll move straight in. Brioni, how do you think boards should be considering decommissioning risk in this environment, and taking into account the changing environment, as I said, overlaid by this accelerating transition? And what should boards be looking to their companies to do in terms of mitigating future risks? And if you could also say a word or two about dispute risks associated with the climate transition and this broader topic of decommissioning.
Sure, thanks, Karina, and lovely to be here today. Thank you for having me. So how should boards be treating decommissioning risk? I mean, as a major priority. I think that's clearly, why we're here. And you've set the scene, and some of the points that you've raised there are very relevant in this context. We've got enhanced decommissioning liabilities, both in terms of, I think, time frame, in terms of expectations of quality of remediation, and also in terms of scope, the number and scope of assets that are likely to need to be remediated within the relevant time frame. And that's all obviously in the context of very public commitments to move towards net zero. The title of this session relates to pathways on that transition. And whilst I think it's quite clear what the obvious large problem is immediately and is going to be with decommissioning. The challenge for boards is really to establish a holistic, well thought through step plan to achieve those decommissioning processes within the relevant timeframes. And obviously there's a lot of uncertainty around that. Now, the issues with pinning it down include regulatory changes. So we'll come on to that, and compliance issues, we'll come on to that in a minute. But market challenges, the actual time frame within which demand for high carbon energy, for example, is likely to diminish is not known, and there are multiple varying predictions on how that might play out. What needs to happen in order to achieve a net zero world by 2050 there's no kind of exact, precise way that one can calculate that. So all boards are suffering with these kind of uncertainties. Coming back to maybe the regulatory piece, there's a regulatory overlay to this whole conversation about decommissioning, and that's the case in every jurisdiction. But first of all, the regulatory position is changing. So a number of jurisdictions are currently revising their laws, introducing different requirements, new standards around both financial assurance standards and the remediation processes themselves. So you've got change, and you've also got international conflict of standards. So different jurisdictions will apply different requirements. And one of the significant challenges, I think, for boards in this area is that international picture. So, we're talking about boards here that are board members of global groups that will have these liabilities arising in multiple different localities around the world. And the standards that are applied in terms of both the way in which financial assurance needs to be held to meet financial obligations and the actual process for decommissioning and remediation will differ. Now, it's okay on the one hand for a local subsidiary to be, doing what's needed to meet the relevant standards in its jurisdiction. And in terms of how it's reported to the board, to some degree, that process may result in a tick for compliance purposes. But there are pathways, certainly in the law at the moment, for creating this kind of extra jurisdictional responsibility for liabilities that arise in, subsidiary companies, perhaps established in other jurisdictions. We've seen that in the UK. And more broadly, you mentioned the kind of, how do you operate? Well, you think about, what if it was on the front page of a newspaper? That's the moral and ethical standards angle is also creating this extra jurisdictional responsibility. So, that needs to be factored in. So it's not just mapping what the compliance standards are and whether you're meeting them in all of the relevant locations, but it's also stepping all those standards up into this beyond compliance world that we're all now operating in. Failure to actually ultimately meet decommissioning liabilities in respect of owned assets is a challenge. There are now more issues arising in terms of where assets are divested. So divestment could have possibly been a more attractive exit route historically, but that route, and we'll come on to talk about it, but that route is now being increasingly kind of closed off, or at least limited. And there are additional, I think, legal and regulatory risks arising around investment. So you've got a lot of factors there. I think I've covered the 3 points that you raised in relation to your question. Did you want me to cover anything else before?
Just one thing, because I then want to turn to Julien, because a lot of the things that you said, I think he'll pick up on, but you use the phrase extrajurisdictional liability. I have to say that 3 times without tripping. I'm reminded of at least one case that was filed in the English courts regarding alleged malfeasance in Nigeria. So do you see those, and the courts accepted it. I don't know if it's actually gone to conclusion yet, but do you see that kind of cross-jurisdictional, legal activity happening so that even in locations where local laws may not be either maybe weak or simply not properly enforced, which is often the case, that companies could still be held accountable, leaving aside the newspaper test and the moral test, could be held accountable in court in countries where the courts are tougher?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what boards have got to plan for. So that's the Vedanta line of kind of court precedent that we've seen coming through, and the view here is that there's not just maybe that sort of maybe private law sort of angle here, but also potentially things like class action type dispute risk coming through. So, a class action dispute perhaps relating to, for example, air quality or similar. Now, those types of dispute, or that dispute environment, is much more advanced in the United States generally than it is elsewhere in the world. But it is definitely something that we are talking to our clients about, mapping the potential for that more, public forum to come through. And then the other thing that we've seen is what might be described as soft law standards being converted more and more into hard law standards. And those soft law standards would include sort of more international guidance or international guidelines or more codes. So we're seeing routes to initiate complaints rather than necessarily court disputes on the grounds of internationally applicable soft law. So one good example is in the human rights space. So we've got the route to make complaints about human rights issues that are occurring in, say, an Asian jurisdiction to through a complaints procedure that's a national complaints procedure based in the UK. So you've got that kind of extra jurisdictional responsibility going on in multiple different ways.
And could you see that same process play out, because human rights are, important but a different topic? Could you see that those same processes being used to go after mismanagement and remediation?
I mean, you can, because you think about the guidelines and how there's a lot of soft law standards around, if you like, ESG, but it's not, within ESG, you do have you do have climate, you've got biodiversity and like kind of standard of living. And when you get into those types of topics, you say it's human rights is a separate topic, but you're not that far away.
Yeah, you're right.
From that borderline. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Right. Julien, over to you. Brioni was mentioning that the legislative regulatory picture is a moving feast. Would you please comment for us, firstly, on the size of this decommissioning problem? How serious is it? How widespread is it? And how would you describe the evolution of investor expectations in this space?
Thank you, Karina, and thank you, Brioni, for the very interesting review of the reputational and other legal risk. Let's start from the second point you mentioned. There is really now, I think, a integration of ESG risk in most institutional investors' strategies. And now, if you look at the way they develop their investment guidelines, the way they develop the investment strategies, clearly taking into account. Last year, Mercer conducted a survey of European investor asset allocation, and 89% of them said they were integrating ESG risk. That's an increase from 55% in 2019. It's worth noting that survey covered 900 institutional investors, 12 different countries, and was prepared before COVID-19 crisis. So you can expect this to go pretty much to 100 now, 100%. How they do this in practice, it's pretty simple. If they don't like someone, they just exclude that investment. So they would not buy equities, they would not buy bonds from issuers or around project with low ESG ratings.
And let me just interrupt you for a second. Are you seeing sectors getting re-rated over this issue? Are you seeing costs of capital actually responding to this kind of tendency to withdraw from these high-risk
Oh,
areas.
we see more than that. If you go on the website of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, you have the names of the companies that have been simply excluded, and you can see clearly some sectors like mining coming out on top. Oil and gas, I mean, the second largest Dutch pension fund, PGGM, has said that they're reconsidering investment in Shell.
Now, my question is not whether divestments are happening. My question is whether you have seen an impact on access, the cost of capital. Like, are companies suffering? Are they struggling to get financing elsewhere?
Yes, this is starting to suffer. They relying more and more on bank loans, for example, rather than issuing. Many of them still can issue bonds. It's not an issue. We're not yet where we are now with tobacco companies, or with, let's say, we were 10 years ago. But the process is pretty much the same. You have so the process is launched that little by little they're being excluded. The other approach you can see, as you know, is that we saw that recently with Exxon, Chevron, and Shell again, is that a lot of investors are putting more people on the boards and saying, we want to, instead of trying to exclude the company, we want them to change their strategy, their corporate strategy as regards ESG and energy transition. But I don't think
anybody on this call who's a board director will have missed the fact that 3 directors lost their jobs over this issue. So yes, that's a very real and very immediate issue.
I think the best headline was it was a cataclysmic day for oil and gas. Suddenly they realized that the power had moved let's say in favor of institutional investors. You can't really fight BlackRock, Legal and General Investment Management, ourselves, CalPERS, and everybody else. I mean, it's difficult. They have almost infinite resources, as simple as possible.
Yeah. But tell me a little bit, because you're talking about they can still access the bond market. Tell me a little bit about what's happening in the bond market and whether there are some opportunities there for companies that are facing, this need to accelerate and broaden their decommissioning activities.
They can access the bond market, but under some conditions. For example, one of the most, brilliant part of the bond market is the green bond and the sustainability or energy transition segments. So you can see that investors are now going to accept to buy bonds only if it's linked to a clear set of metrics, KPIs, key performance indicators or key risk indicators linked to energy transition, carbon emission, other type of KPI, linked clearly to an outcome that will be in the end favorable to climate change. And if those metrics are not respected, so those objectives are not met, usually what happens is that the actual interest rate on the bond increases. So there is an attraction for both sides, so incentive on both sides. We buy this because because they are linked completely to our own investment objectives, own investment guidelines. We sell them on the company side because they're cheaper for us as source of capital. So this is the incentive. At the same time, there's another issue that suddenly appears, is that when you force companies to accelerate their energy transition, you force them to start to move away from polluting asset classes, or let's say operations. Well, you do something which is sort of a bit contradictory, it's a bit of a conflict. Suddenly you ask them to decommission even faster. So suddenly those companies are facing more and more decommission liabilities. They're already facing a lot of them. They have to decommission more and faster. And the implications are quite dramatic because you need equipment. I mean, when you are a mining company, to close a coal mine, you need to do a number of things. And you could close it's not easy to close a mine, but then also you have to clean any sort of waterways, pond, lake around this, coal pretty polluting on this, or something with copper and silver, copper and gold, sorry, they linked in as ores in mines, where usually you have some sort of like arsenic and all sort of nice stuff coming out of the ground, mercury, for example. So all those things have to be done, and often the resources are not there. Finally, there's something else happening. It's not only you have more to do in shorter time, but now you have also regulations bringing new health and safety standards, which in practice, for the same operation you would do in the past of decommissioning and remediation, now the standards being more stringent, it costs more. So you might not even have the people capable of doing that, but it's actually more expensive anyway. So when we look at in practice of the cost of decommissioning, and we talk about 120 companies, 119 technically, nuclear, traditional power, I mean coal-fired power plants, mining and oil and gas, and we looked at the evolution of recognized liabilities, decommissioning, environmental, industrial liabilities on balance sheets, stuff that's completely published, completely public. And we saw that from 2015 to 2020, the increase was 30%, from $320 billion to 416, an increase of $100 billion. You have to see that only the nuclear sector has any offsetting assets. Only the nuclear sector is putting money aside to make sure that they have enough to close down. I mean, nobody would imagine a nuclear power plant be left with radioactive waste fuel lying around. Nobody would do this. Why are they accepting the same thing with coal mines or other type of polluting assets is really surprised. What you're noticing now, and coming back to your first remark about the impact of energy transition on cost of capital, you notice that those liabilities represent between 15 and 20% of the market cap of those companies. That was at the end of 2020, so 6 months ago. They also represent 15 to 50% of the adjusted net debt. We reintegrated the liabilities into the net debt, long-term liabilities, as S&P does. So really wanted to see what it means. So now you have another issue. This thing is the biggest liability on balance sheets. It's pretty much the focus of all aspects. This is something you have to solve at the same time where the sources of capital are drying up. So the moment where you need the money is potentially going away because you haven't done enough. So I think probably potentially should be the writing is on the wall. Do something soon, because this is potentially a very, very serious issue. The credit rating agencies will downgrade. That will happen. Equity investors will be more and more worried about this. Institutional investors will more and more exclude. So there's a potentially a virtuous process where people do something positive. They put also potentially also a less virtuous process where companies at one point do not get any more money to operate. That would be the bad thing. So in practice, what we suggest, I mean, it seems to be obvious. We're talking something that's, you have a retirement problem. So try to find retirement solutions. Put money aside as soon as possible. Have a pot of money dedicated, earmarked to decommissioning, exactly like the nuclear has done for years. The nuclear sector has been doing this for 30, 40 years. That's actually a normal practice there. Do that. It reduces the reliance on operating cash flow to clean those decommissioning liabilities, to clean those mines, to clean those offshore drilling platforms, and so on and so forth. It's also helps mitigate the risk of expense volatility. We've seen that regulation is pushing up and down prices because of new standards, because of lack of resources. And also that reduces the pressure on balance sheet or capital, cost of capital and rating pressure, because you're meeting a long-term liability with cash which is allocated in investments.
Exactly.
One last point I could mention,
go ahead.
Yeah, just on this is that this also potentially the only way for your business to be sustainable. More and more regulations are basically saying that if you do not treat your previous legacy risk in a good way in terms of funding the decommissioning, you're probably not going to be allowed to dig holes and exploit and produce in a new projects. If when you link the past and the future, exactly like we would do in economy with a life cycle for savings, there's incentives to do well with the past, to have some sort of future. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to survive. Sorry.
I have an observation, if I may, on what you said, but also a question coming from the audience, which happens to be the question that I ask in my boardroom on a regular basis, and it's a tough one. So the observation is that, you made some statements about these liabilities being equivalent to 15 to 20% of the market cap of these companies. And my understanding is that these figures are figures that you have generated from analyzing the accounts of the companies. Having brought your analysis into my company, because I was very alarmed by that figure, what I was told, and I suspect we're not alone in this, is that, and you had said my company was the most transparent, we're not as transparent as we ought to be. If we're going to give you the accurate figures for you to reach an accurate conclusion. And I think what this points to, from what you've said, is that it behooves all of us as directors to urge our companies to be fully transparent about the scale of these liabilities. Because in the absence of transparency, people like you, Julien, are going to make inferences about how good or bad it is. And it may well be that these analyses are far more pessimistic than is true. I don't know. So this is, I think, a really important takeaway from this whole discussion, is that this issue has been kind of, under a rock for a very long time. It's coming out, it's being forced out from under that rock because of the transition and because of all of the things we heard about greater investor and societal expectations. But we don't have the measurement and disclosure standards that I think are necessary in this case. I also want to turn to a question that came from the audience, which is this. We're seeing quite a few companies under pressure dispose of assets in order to shrink the scale of their business in high emitting businesses. And they often sell them to local operators who are smaller, who are private, and who don't experience the same level of scrutiny. And we really need to ask ourselves, and this is what our questioner has said, how do we create a culture, and ideally an incentive system, that induces companies to not to displace the problem by selling it to an operator who doesn't care. Like, can we find a buyer that doesn't care is kind of the mantra, I think, of the badly behaved company. And instead, to do some of the things that I know we're going to come to in the later part of our session, which is looking at the opportunities that reside in these assets. I just read this morning, some of you may have seen, that Glencore has acquired the remaining 2/3 of the Cerrejón coal mine, thermal coal mine in Colombia, from BHP Billiton and Anglo American, both of which are exiting the coal business. And Glencore happily snapped it up at a very low price, and then declared this is the better way to deal with this issue, because had they sold them to someone else, they would have been operated in a much less responsible way. We're going to operate these coal assets to global standards, and we will use the cash that we generate from those activities to fund our growth in the cleaner minerals, right? So
there are more live examples, right?
Yeah,
Karina, of that sort of happening. I mean, one of the reported experiences of Exxon and its Bass Strait Australia oil and gas assets, I think towards the end of last year, was a market evaluation. I think they described it as a process in terms of trying to establish whether or not there was maybe an appetite and an attractive price for sale. Ultimately resulted in them determining that they would hold and decommission themselves. So they'd continue to produce, decommission themselves. And that was, documented in direct statements from Exxon in terms of its decision. Now there's a major jurisdictional regulatory overlay, I think, to that process at present in Australia, given that there was intense focus after the Woodside issues. And, in one sense, it's sort of the question, if you like, maybe presents it like an option, like, oh yeah, we could divest or we could do something else. But actually, I think one of the major risks is the realization that divestment opportunity is likely to be shrinking. Now, Glencore may be taking a different approach in respect of mining assets and actually trying to find a pathway there for responsible end of life processing for mining assets. But in the oil and gas industry, I think there's been a sort of a stepping away from the table of the larger companies that perhaps may have the resources to carry out responsible end of life remediation, from wanting to invest in aging assets at this stage in their life and at this stage in the global sort of climate, environment and economic process. So that means that divestment is really leaving you with only, well, maybe a couple of options. There's the Thungela, example from South Africa as well that we could talk about, where they sold mining assets into a publicly listed company that they'd also capitalized fairly significantly as well with cash, you know, attempting to take more of a objective approach towards the ultimate remediation of those mines at the end of their life. It remains to be seen whether or not that is a responsible approach. I mean, you know, all of the sort of the bad examples get lots and lots of press, right? The disasters get lots of press, but there are people out there trying to think of ways to do this, I think, to divest. But divestment is becoming less available as an opportunity, and more companies are being forced to hold to the end of life and then
clean it up,
decommission themselves. So you've got, I think, as a board, you've got to understand that maybe it's we can describe it as an old model of sort of, you know, selling it off to smaller and smaller companies towards the end of life. It's just not available. It's certainly not in all jurisdictions anymore.
Well, and it's certainly the case that the amount that you can realize from those sales is not as great as might have been expected in the past. Olivier, I want to turn to you because right, exactly. Olivier, I'd like to turn to you because I think you have a lot to comment on what we've just heard. And then we can come back to some of the other questions, including some from the audience regarding what you were talking about, Brioni. But I want to turn to Olivier first. And what can you say from your experience of working directly with these industrial players? What are you seeing happen? How are you seeing them respond to these regulatory pressures, the investor pressures, et cetera, and to the transition?
So thank you, Karina, and thanks to Chapter Zero for inviting me. So for sure, we can see different players acting very differently. As mentioned by Julien and Brioni, for sure, the international players, the most well-known, the Exxon, the Shell, the Total, the BP, and others, are putting a lot of attention on that topic, and they consider it very, very seriously due to the risk of reputation for them, which is huge, and they consider their liabilities as something very important. They put some money on the side. Is it enough or not? It's not so easy because this type of issues, dismantling, is well known. But by the way, in terms of operations, you have some surprise time to time. So the amount could be higher than expected, and it's due to the lack of equipment time to time, the difficulty to do it, but also the change in regulation, which is something good, of course. The evolution of the regulation, it's very efficient to change the things, but it's something very important that they have to take into consideration. That's the first thing. But when we look at this company, this super well-known company, they represent nothing. I would say nothing. They represent only 15% of the oil and gas production worldwide. And we can put pressure on them. The board of directors in these companies are people that are well-known, and I'm sure we have some of them at this session. But when you have to discuss with a national oil company, for instance, in different countries, it's completely different. Yeah. Because first, they own the resources, and they think they could manage it as they want. So I think it's quite important, first, that the industry could define standards, industry standards, you know, the things that could be coming from North Sea or Gulf of Mexico, where they have done things not so badly, to be honest. But it's quite important to define standards and to put pressure on everyone, every producing countries, to apply these standards. We've seen some changes very recently in some countries that are, I would say, very positive. We discussed just a few minutes ago with Julien and Brioni about what's going on in Angola, and I think it's a very positive signal for this part of the world. Is it enough?
Is that something that you're seeing beyond Angola? Is this a trend that you're seeing, that more and more governments are tightening up on this?
I would say more and more governments are trying to do things, and but it's not so easy, and in some part of the world it's not so clear, and even in some very important producing countries. So it's something that we need to push and to adopt some international standards with a strong regulation to ensure something very well. The things will be done very, very well.
It seems to me that this is exactly the sort of thing that the trade associations do. The American Petroleum Institute is famous for defining, industry standards. Have they not been looking at this?
So, most of the time, these producing countries, they try to do their best, and but for many political reasons, it's not always very easy. They do not have all the capabilities for these dismantling activities because it's not easy. You have many things to do and to manage. It's like the big project. In fact, it's a big project, but at the end of a life, so you have to do many things, and technically, it's not easy. On top of that, you have to manage the full supply chain, because when you start to dismantle something, the equipment and so on, it's huge. It's thousands of tons of equipment, and it's quite important to be accountable for the full supply chain.
Indeed.
Indeed, that's, up to the recycling, because time to time, and unfortunately some examples exist and they are negative, but the company decided to dismantle. It's done with contractors who get, the whatever, it's an FPSO, whatever, a platform. And then you will find some equipment, sub-equipment, subsystems dismantled in a part of the world where, unfortunately, many things are not respected.
Right.
And it happens, and it's a huge risk for the companies, because a day or another, it will be known.
Exactly right. We have a question from the audience to you, Olivier, that I think is very germane to what you're talking about. The question is, are there any pure play decommissioning companies that are emerging whose core business is to get out there and clean up? And this questioner raises it specifically in the context of the nuclear sector, but I think it's actually a generic question.
Yeah, we see some players, and some of them are already well known in oil and gas, and I would say they contribute to the mega project for the building part. So they are able to support also the decommissioning, because you need major equipments, you need amazing cranes, to take away from the water thousands and thousands of tons of metals. So it's a real job, and you need very expert company to manage that.
Right. So it's not something that most companies do with their in-house teams.
Yeah. You have to. You can't do that with beginners, I would say.
Right.
It's too important. And the damages could be very huge. Then there is another thing that is important. I think it's, for some assets, you can think also on the repurposing.
Well, this is exactly what I was going to come to, because we've got 15 minutes left, and I wanted to exactly ask you that question. What about flipping it to the positive side? What levers do we have to make use of these assets and basically give them a second life, repurpose them to take advantage of new business opportunities? What do you see happening?
So we start to see interesting things, and and some of them were really based on the observation of what happened on some assets in the past. And personally, I was lucky to visit some assets in Norway, in the North Sea region, where you see some old assets nearby, some new assets, where you can find some colonies of seals living there, and starting to really to be observed by environmentalists and biologists and so on, and starting to say, well, they are very well here. They have a lot of babies and so on. So the colonies is growing and growing. So it could be very interesting to do that, and it's done already. Some assets are, like artificial reefs in the US. We have very quickly. When I say very quickly, it takes 5 to 10 years, but it's at the end it's not so long. You start to see a lot of fish coming back, and you start to regenerate an ecosystem. Of course, it's better to have real reef. I'm not going to discuss that for sure, but it's something that also could be done in a proper way. So artificial reef is very good. Of course, we can also create interesting things with carbon capture in the reservoir, which is something important for the energy transition.
So you're talking about depleted oil wells being used as a place to sequester. Yes,
and some areas are very well located in the world to management. Some others are more difficult, but for some in the North Sea region, it would make a lot of sense.
Indeed. Okay. Julien, I'm sure you have something to contribute on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of points. First of all, I think the repurposing, which is a big hope for a lot of people, is really in infant stages, and except a few cases in California, Gulf of Mexico, and very, very few cases now in North Sea, it's completely minor. It's really marginal compared to the big problem. Although there are a couple of anecdotal cases, Glencore in Canada, they bought a Xstrata, and Xstrata had done a really good job there. So in the mining sector, there are some good ideas going on. So there's stuff that happened, but they are still marginal. It's true that when you see that your asset can have another life into something else, it's fantastic. I mean, it's like restoring a building. It used to be, I don't know, a school or military base. It becomes a social housing council. Is really great. It's really great. I mean, social housing for SEALs or for something similar. So I mean, really, we have there's plenty of things. However, it is complex and it's really expensive. By the way, it's not that easy to do. The other thing is, I would like to mention when you're coming about the fact that people are trying to dump polluting assets into other people. I mean, less sort of ESG-minded companies or jurisdictions. Yeah, we've seen things happening recently. BP selling the Alaskan assets have done quite well for BP, probably less well for Alaska. But this is just a discussion we'll probably have to have separately. But this is not viable in the end because, as Virginie mentioned, first of all, there's less and less people ready to buy, and secondly, more and more potential authorities are very, very mindful of this and saying, checking what companies do with old assets, and if they're just dumping them, that's potentially a no-go red flag for new assets. So those companies in the future will have to take care of old assets, if only to make sure they have a future. Lastly, and this is something I would like to mention, even if many of the big companies, known sort of major oil and gas majors and mining majors, have done not badly in terms of cash, they have rarely earmarked funds for decommissioning for the long term. That's absolutely not something they've done for pensions. Pensions, they really put a lot of money. I mean, if you look at those BP has 30 or 40 billions in pension assets, Exxon something 15 or 20. So those guys have really funded their pension plans. So if you do to take the analogy of trying to put money aside for retirement of our asset, they should at least try to do something similar they've done for pensions. It's just because you don't want retirees to have no money, starve because they simply have no retirement. Likewise, you don't want polluting assets to end up affecting the lives of thousands of people everywhere on the planet. Even if they're not in the same country, those companies are sort of legally located. One last point I'd like to mention is that those numbers that we see on balance sheets, they are technically gross of sort of tax refunds, tax credit, and a few other things. However, they also sometimes include a lot of optimistic assumptions on what technical progress or efficiency gains they could gain. So there's plenty of things there that are sort of mitigating factors. If you were to clean everything, I'm not sure that the minuses will reduce significantly the costs, the overall cost. If anything, I think they're potentially much higher than what we're seeing. Why am I saying this is because the last few years we saw that 30% increase at exactly the moment where sort of there was a little bit more focus on what decommissioning was about. Suddenly the cost has increased. So I don't want to be completely cynical there, but if costs increase at the moment where everybody started looking at the cost, means that potentially before that they were not always clearly laid out, so clearly presented. I do believe that they are manageable. Most companies can deal with them most oil companies, more mining companies, the big ones, that should be able to deal with that with no problem. I'm very, 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 very worried about the second tier and the third tier. As we mentioned, the ones which don't have the resources, what do they do? I mean, especially if they start to buy for 5 or 6 minutes on late life operators for oil, 10 years of whatever they have and can pump out. Those guys, I mean, even third tier, second tier, I've seen some rich companies who can deal with that. But beyond that, there's bigger worries, because what will happen? Is it going to be again a taxpayer that's going to have to foot the bill?
You know, I feel a new IFRS coming on, because it seems like there's so much discretion used in how companies provision for this, report on it, set their own standards of what's going to be adequate. And, you know, when you were talking about the need for, global standards to be developed, that's the first step. The second step is accounting standards and disclosure standards, so that investors know. I mean, we have that's standard for pension funds. That's why we have such, transparency. It also is the case that there is a constituency that demands good pension funding, right? Whereas the constituency of the biosphere doesn't have a very loud voice, and so it's more difficult to get that done. But it's interesting. Okay, we've got 8 minutes left, and I want to give each of you an opportunity to answer the question that really weighs on me, and I'm sure on all of the board directors at this table, and that is, if there's one decommissioning related question that you wish your board would ask of management, or in your case, you wish, Julien, you wish your client would ask its management, and same with you, Briony. Actually, all three of you, it's all clients. What do you think boards should be demanding, or demanding in terms of action, or querying in terms of information? So let's start with you, Briony.
Okay, I'm going to say that it's not transition planning itself, the steps to decommissioning an asset, how to do it, how much it's going to cost, ultimately, you know, whether you're going to meet the relevant remediation standards is one aspect. I think there's some interest in the audience, and it's something that I'm really interested in, is about associated negative impact of the transition. And I'm talking about just transition, and about not just abandoned assets, but abandoned communities.
Suppliers.
Yeah, abandoned communities that sit around the process that you are acceleratedly decommissioning. How much mapping has been done to consider those knock-on effects and mitigating knock-on negative effects? You know, there are some examples that stand out to me. So in Alberta, Canada, I understand that there's a fund that was put together, a public fund, which is focused on oil well cleanup. But it's not just focused on like the environmental remediation aspect of that. It's focused on employment of people in local communities being reskilled from oil well work into oil well cleanup work. And that's a tiny example. But you know, you look at the UK and maybe the impact of, the kind of mining happened really, decommissioning of mining on a big scale, right, happened here much earlier. And I'm from the north of England. And I remember, the mining kind of crisis in the 80s. And you don't want that communal impact to be happening around this process that's supposed to be ESG positive and is climate positive, but you've got to take that broader view. So that's my kind of, if you like, thing to leave you with today.
I think that's a great one. How about you, Olivier?
So as a board director, I will ask to the team, show me the scenario planning, please, for each investment. And do not forget to show me the boomerang effect, because it's fine to look at the return on investment after 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, but there is something that is missing. That's the end of the life. How much does it cost, really?
Yeah.
And I know that it's very difficult to forecast that. Very, very difficult. By the way, I would ask. I would ask that to the CEO.
Our job is to ask difficult questions, isn't it? We don't have to come up with the answers. It's your job is to advise management on how to answer them, right? All right, over to you, Julien.
Well, I've learned a lesson when I was working in banking in first years is to trust, but always check. So I will ask the board to check the actual size of decommissioning exposure, understand if there are tax credits, tax refunds, check as Olivier said, the assumptions, what are the possible evolution of those liabilities. For example, what if the inflation start to pick up? What if the actual specialized and technical resources are not available? What are the check the local regulation, check the planning on the decommissioning. Is there a decommissioning reserve? How is it funded? What are potentially the work to be done with partners? Check everything. And this is not, given the size of the liability, this is not a specifically unrealistic request. It is, you're looking at something that represents now half the debt. So you potentially should be spending a lot of time looking at it, because it should be 50% of your time looking at that should be spent on this. Or depending on the case. That's the only thing I would say. Check. It's my only main recommendation.
Interesting. Okay. And we have 4 minutes left. I'm going to give a very quick summary, I'm going to try, of what we discussed today. If I could only find where I put my notes. And all right, well, I've lost my notes. Hold on.
While you look, Karina, just to pick up, there was
I got it.
Interesting. Oh, you found
it?
Yes,
that's okay. Go ahead. Got it.
No, I was just going to say there was an interesting point as well about came up in the Q&A about offshore wind. And it is really interesting about, thinking about this, not just in the context of like now of, oil and gas assets or, decommissioning those fossil fuel energy assets, but also about every single energy process that we have. How sustainable is it? And what about its end of life? It's really important to apply these learnings, not just in the immediate emergency, but to every, if you're divesting of oil and gas stocks but buying wind energy, renewable energy companies, have they got this sorted? Is that really sustainable? If not, so that's a really important feature.
Great question. Great question. So in the 2 minutes that we have left, I'm going to summarize what we covered today. First of all, that this must be a board priority. Expectations are increasing, the scope, the scale of the problem is significant, and the time frame is coming down. And it is very important for companies to establish a holistic plan in how they look at this. Regulations are changing. And there's a lot of uncertainty in the market with respect to how the transition is going to play out. We know that we have to get to net zero by 2050. We don't exactly know which pathway is going to be followed and what implications that's going to have for each of our companies. We have to be mindful of the fact that there are significant inconsistencies from one jurisdiction to another, and that it's not enough to comply with what the rule is locally for two reasons. One is the newspaper test. The other is the risk of litigation. Because more and more cases are being brought across borders to jurisdictions that will listen to them more favorably. And then you also have the risk of class action for the extent to which the impacts of the operation might have caused damage to the broad community, thinking of air quality and water quality, for example. Really interesting thoughts on divestment. Divestment was naively seen as the way to get rid of a problem. And we're seeing now that that is simply no longer the case. It is being challenged more and more. I certainly get this question from investors more and more. If your pathway to net zero involves selling to other operators, what have you achieved? And so really taking responsibility for the entire life cycle of the asset doesn't mean offloading it to somebody else. Interesting remarks from Julien also about the scale of ESG adoption in the investor community, that it's reached 89% as of last year in Europe. Sadly, that's not the case in other parts of the world, by the way, because I'm on the investment committee of a US board, and I am having to argue with my fellow committee members about the introduction of ESG measures, and there is a cultural chasm still between Europe and the rest of the world, but it is changing, and certainly the fact that we're having this debate on my US board is indicative of that. Important to consider also the changes that are happening beyond just the equity markets, green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, and also the fact that exclusion and divestment is starting to drive up the cost of capital for certain types of activities. On the other hand, it's not even just the investment community, whether banking, debt, or equities, that is forcing change. It's also in some cases jurisdictions that are holding companies to account for their assets and not letting them sell them off. We heard, and this is a major takeaway for me, that there is a crying need for industry to develop global standards. So that we have consistency, and I think consistency in reporting is also necessary. Personally, I worry about investors forming conclusions on the basis of imperfect disclosure, and that's not good for anybody. We talked about opportunities, and unfortunately, so far, I think our main takeaway is that they are not fully developed and well understood, and that some of these opportunities are costly. So we're in the early stages of moving towards those opportunities. And I think the challenge for a company is that if directors haven't got their head around the fact that these assets must be retired, what they're looking at is the opportunity cost of operating them. And they're looking at what can we still earn from this oil well or this coal mine or this chemical plant versus A, the cost of cleaning it up, and B, the cost of, creating a seal colony. It's not a very convincing case until people get it into their head that these assets are obsolescent, that we don't have a choice. And that doubt is I think, standing in the way of these decisions. Interesting remark about how the way that provisions should be made for these liabilities should really be modeled on the pension fund system, where adequate funding is a highly scrutinized indicator, and companies are not let off the hook for a seriously unfunded pension liability. And I think that is getting us close to the end. Yes, really important point. This is the one that keeps me up at night, by the way, and that is the question of stranded suppliers and stranded communities. As these companies start to shrink their activities, particularly in lower income countries where the economy is hugely dependent on these activities. It's as hard as it may seem for us as companies to shrink down and ultimately exit, it's devastating for these countries. And as companies, my personal view, and I think echoed by Brioni, is that we have an obligation to think through the implications of that exit and what we are leaving behind. Personally, I think we need to wean people off dependence on our industries and help ease them into alternative activities that are going to build their prosperity in a sustainable way. And in terms of the questions that you asked, we want to see more evidence from boards. Should want to see more evidence from management about the scenario planning around each and every investment, so that we see it through to the end of its life cycle, so that we as board have full mastery over the end of life or afterlife of those assets, not to just show us the cash flows for the productive period, which incidentally is exactly how they're calculated, and check the details of the decommissioning process. Really ask for some real scrutiny and real detail on our access to resources, the extent to which we are complying, our expectations of changes in rules, how those reserves are calculated, how they are disclosed, how they are funded. Because in Julien's the analyses, these can be worth as much as half of our debt on average. And that's a very, very big number. And so as boards, we need to pay attention. So with that, I am going to thank you all very much for your excellent contributions. Thank you to our audience for some really smart questions, which I did my best to incorporate into the discussion. And yeah, goodbye, everyone. And please remember to fill out the feedback form.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.